Introduction. This is the long-awaited part 2 of our deep dive into the most forbidden inventions in history, the ones that weren't just forgotten, they were erased. Some of these machines defied the known laws of physics. Others promised free energy, anti-gravity, or control over matter itself. Too advanced, too disruptive, and in many cases too dangerous to be allowed. They never made it into textbooks. They vanished from public records. And those who created them were silenced, ignored, or simply disappeared. But today we're digging them up, one by one. If you think part 1 was strange, this time the secrets go even deeper. Prepare to question what's real, what was possible, and what was deliberately hidden from us all. Let's begin. Pantone's GEET fuel system. In the dusty corners of forgotten engineering labs and beneath the buzzing neon lights of underground science expos, there are inventions whispered about, not discussed. One of them is Pantone's GEET fuel processor, a system so simple in its core idea, yet so radical in implication that many refuse to believe it could exist. Others believe too much. GET stands for Global Environmental Energy Technology. But behind the acronym is a device that, if true, had the potential to overturn the modern oil economy. Pantone's machine wasn't just an engine modification, it was a rebuke to the fundamental structure of fossil fuel consumption. The GET device claimed to allow internal combustion engines to run on a hybrid of gasoline and almost anything else. Water, coffee, soda, paint thinner, even used motor oil. At the heart of the GET system was a strange process Pantone called plasma reformation. His system worked by vaporizing a fuel mixture and running it through a magnetized steel reactor tube. There, it was said, the fuel underwent a transformation, producing a plasma-like vapor that could power an engine with far less pollution and fuel consumption. This wasn't just about efficiency. The emissions from GET-adapted engines were reportedly so clean they measured almost nothing.
No carbon monoxide. No hydrocarbons.
Just oxygen and water vapor. For a world suffocating in exhaust fumes, this was a miracle. Or it should have been. But instead of Nobel Prizes and Industrial Revolution, Pantone found himself swallowed by controversy. Skeptics labeled him a fraud, citing a lack of peer-reviewed evidence and theoretical clarity. His reactor, though simple in appearance, defied traditional combustion science. Engineers said it couldn't work. It violated too many rules. And yet, in small garages and backyards, tinkerers replicated it. Videos began to surface online. Shaky footage of lawnmowers running on turpentine and water, cars idling on cola. What followed was a spiral that would define the rest of Pantone's life. As the tension grew, so did pressure. He claimed he was being harassed, followed, and threatened. At one point, he alleged that corporations and government entities were deliberately sabotaging his work, ensuring it would never gain traction. The oil economy, after all, had no place for a device that made gasoline nearly obsolete. In a particularly grim turn, Pantone was later institutionalized in a psychiatric facility under murky circumstances. He claimed he was held against his will and that his inventions were stolen while he was confined. To some, this was proof that he had lost touch with reality. To others, it was evidence that he was silenced. The GET system became a fringe fascination. It lived on in the underground world of free energy believers, individuals and groups convinced that society had been denied access to technologies that could solve the energy crisis. Forums, YouTube videos, and improvised blueprints kept the GET flame alive. But mainstream science kept its distance. The lack of controlled studies and Pantone's erratic behavior made it easy to dismiss. Yet something about the GET story lingers. The design wasn't some arcane mess of wires and mystical jargon. It was mechanical, tangible. People had built it. They had seen it work. Or they believed they had. And that is perhaps the most haunting part of the GET saga. The uncertainty. Was it a miracle suppressed? Or a myth believed too deeply? Pantone himself passed away in 2015. He died in relative obscurity, his name known only in circles where science meets paranoia and hope. His life had spiraled from invention to isolation, from innovation to institutionalization. The official record lists him as a fringe inventor, someone who believed too much in something that couldn't be. But for those who still experiment with his blueprints, who weld steel tubes in garages late into the night, Paul Pantone is something else entirely. He is a symbol of forbidden possibility, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous inventions are not the ones that don't work, but the ones that just might. And so, the GET fuel system remains in a strange limbo. It exists in grainy videos, second-hand testimonials, and obscure schematics passed through the cracks of the internet. It is not taught in schools. It is not studied in universities. It is not debated on television. It has, in every sense that matters, been erased. But the echoes are still there, for those who choose to listen. Viktor Schauberger's implosion technology. In the vast theater of forgotten genius, few names echo with the haunting clarity of Viktor Schauberger. An Austrian forester, naturalist, and inventor, he was no ordinary scientist. He did not see the world as a collection of equations or materials to be conquered. He believed the natural world followed a higher form of logic, one rooted in spiral flows, implosion, and the quiet intelligence of water. While most of 20th century science sprinted toward explosions, combustion engines, nuclear fission, and high-speed industrial growth, Schauberger looked in the opposite direction. He believed that nature did not explode. It imploded. It did not force movement through pressure and violence, but through suction, attraction, and harmony. He studied mountain streams obsessively, sometimes sitting for hours beside a single eddy, watching how water spiraled, twisted, and danced. He became convinced that water was not just a physical substance, it was alive or at least possessed a kind of memory, a will, and that by understanding its true behavior, humanity could unlock an energy source both limitless and peaceful. His experiments led him to develop a revolutionary concept, implosion technology. In essence, Schauberger's idea was deceptively simple. Instead of mimicking explosions like engines and turbines do, blasting force outward to generate movement, his machines would follow the path of implosion, pulling matter inward. He believed that by mimicking the inward spiraling vortexes seen in nature, in whirlpools, tornadoes, galaxies, one could tap into a cleaner, more potent form of energy. The implications were staggering. He built prototypes, metal cones and pipes, spiraling copper channels and bizarre egg-shaped engines, all designed to spin water or air inwards, faster and faster, until something changed. The energy output, he claimed, began to exceed the input, not because of magic, but because the machine was working with nature's flow, not against it. One such machine, called the Repulsine, allegedly achieved levitation by spinning air in high-velocity vortices. Some witnesses claimed it lifted slightly off the ground. Others whispered about its ability to bend gravity, though Schauberger never used such dramatic words himself. He always spoke in terms of natural energy, of frictionless movement, of harmony with the Earth's own pulse. But the world was not ready for Schauberger. His ideas were ridiculed by academics, many of whom viewed his theories as mystical nonsense. He refused to conform to the rigid structures of mainstream science. He had no formal physics training, no laboratory pedigree. What he offered was too strange, too poetic, and far too threatening to established energy systems. During World War II, the German military took notice. Schauberger was allegedly forced to work on secret projects under Nazi supervision. They were interested in his Repulsine and its supposed anti-gravity capabilities. Whether his work directly contributed to the legendary Nazi flying saucer myths is unknown, but the parallels are eerie. He later said that he was appalled by their intentions, that his technology was meant to heal, not to dominate. After the war, his story takes an even darker turn. In the 1950s, Schauberger was approached by American interests, individuals who promised him resources, laboratories, and a platform for his ideas. Desperate to see his vision realized, he traveled to the United States. But things did not go as planned. Shortly after arriving, he was pressured into signing over the rights to all his patents and documents. His machines were taken. He was allegedly isolated, interrogated, and manipulated. When he returned to Austria, he was a broken man, exhausted, disillusioned, and devastated. 5 days after returning home, Viktor Schauberger died. No prototypes were returned. No blueprints released. His remaining notes were disorganized, scattered across journals and sketches, written in a mix of German, symbols, and metaphors few could interpret. His family tried to preserve what they could, but his most advanced work was lost or taken. What remains is a strange legacy. Implosion technology, as Schauberger envisioned it, is still not taught in schools. It sits outside the boundaries of accepted science, labeled as pseudoscience, mysticism, or delusion, and yet, it refuses to disappear. In the decades since his death, small groups of engineers and thinkers have tried to rebuild his devices. The repulsine has been recreated in various forms, spinning wildly on YouTube videos and forums dedicated to fringe science. Some claim to see results. Others dismiss them as illusions. But whether or not the machines ever truly worked misses the deeper truth. Schauberger's vision wasn't just about technology. It was about our relationship to nature. He believed that the violent systems we've built, combustion engines, mining, war, are symptoms of our spiritual disconnection from the world we inhabit. He warned that if we continued to force nature to serve us through violence, we would destroy ourselves. He saw a future of poisoned rivers, dead soil, and barren skies, a prophecy that grows more real with each passing year. He offered a different path, one where energy flowed like a mountain stream, cold, clean, and alive. One where machines did not scream, but hummed with the sound of water spiraling inward. And yet, we turned away. Today, Schauberger's name lives on in the margins. His writings are scattered across rare books and PDF scans. His machines gather dust in obscure museums or lie buried in basements. His reputation hovers between genius and madman, prophet and crank. But perhaps that's the fate of those who walk ahead of their time, to be misunderstood, ridiculed, and finally erased. Still, in the quiet there are whispers of energy without destruction, of water with memory, of machines that breathe with the forest, and of a man who tried to show us how to listen. Hieronymus Machine. In 1949, the United States Patent Office granted a patent for a device that few people fully understood, and many still refuse to believe was real. The inventor, Thomas Galen Hieronymus, claimed that his creation could detect and analyze a previously unknown form of energy emitted by all living and non-living things. He called it alloptic energy, a blend of electric and optic, though he admitted that it was unlike any electromagnetic force known to physics. According to Hieronymus, every substance had its own unique alloptic signature, a subtle radiation that could be detected, analyzed, and potentially manipulated using a carefully arranged set of components. Copper coils, resistors, vacuum tubes, and most curiously, a flat metal stick plate that responded not to instruments, but to the human touch. His invention, now commonly referred to as the Hieronymus Machine, was not a hoax or a performance art piece. It was designed and documented like any other electrical device of its time. The machine supposedly worked by tuning into the alloptic frequency of a sample placed in a chamber, for instance, a leaf or a rock, and allowing the operator to feel a response on the metal plate through subtle tactile feedback. When the tuning was correct, the operator would experience a specific, sticking sensation with their fingers, signaling a successful energetic lock onto the target material. There was no conventional explanation for how the device worked. The stick plate was not connected to any active current. The response depended entirely on human sensation, which made it impossible to standardize. Yet, despite this, Hieronymus demonstrated the device publicly. He claimed it could identify diseases in plants, determine the mineral content of rock samples, and even influence biological growth at a distance. These weren't rumors, they were documented demonstrations, sometimes witnessed by curious engineers or editors. In fact, the machine gained significant attention in the 1950s when John W. Campbell, editor of astounding science fiction and a vocal advocate for speculative science, became personally fascinated with Hieronymus's work. Campbell claimed that even a symbolic representation of the machine, a circuit diagram drawn in pencil on paper, was capable of producing the same results as the physical device. This suggestion pushed the machine even further outside the boundaries of conventional science. If true, it implied that the device did not function through electricity or materials, but through the structure of information or pattern itself. In other words, intention and form were enough. At this point, the machine became associated with a larger and even more controversial field: radionics, the use of devices to detect and treat disease through supposed energy fields that mainstream science does not recognize. The field had been marginalized even in the early 20th century, and Hieronymus's work, while technically distinct, was grouped with it. Despite the ridicule from established scientists, some agricultural researchers and independent experimenters began using variations of the Hieronymus machine for plant diagnostics, soil quality assessments, and in some cases, remote influence experiments. Hieronymus insisted that the energy he was working with was real, measurable, and natural, simply not yet accepted by mainstream physics. He argued that it was not mystical but simply unfamiliar. Skeptics criticized his lack of empirical data and reproducible experiments. The tactile nature of the stick plate response made blind testing difficult, and independent studies were few. The U.S. government never formally banned the device, but no institutional research followed. It was easier to dismiss the entire concept than to try to explain how a non-electric schematic drawn on paper could produce measurable results. Still, there were persistent rumors that various intelligence and military organizations had taken a quiet interest in the technology. During the Cold War, the CIA and other agencies were known to experiment with fringe sciences, including remote viewing, mind influence studies, and psychotronics. It was plausible that a device claiming to detect energy fields remotely would be examined at some level, even if only to determine whether foreign adversaries were pursuing similar paths. But nothing concrete ever surfaced. No files.
No trials. No debunking papers.
Just silence. For Hieronymus, this silence was both frustrating and telling. He believed that institutional science had grown too narrow, and that real breakthroughs were being suppressed or ignored because they didn't fit within established theories. He continued to work on his ideas, granting interviews and publishing limited writings, but by the 1980s, his name had largely faded from public view. He passed away in 1988, having never gained the recognition he felt his work deserved. Today, the Hieronymus machine is not part of scientific curricula. It is not studied in engineering programs or physics departments. It lives on in fragments, schematics on obscure websites, references in books about suppressed inventions, and the occasional homemade replica built by independent researchers. To mainstream science, it is a curiosity at best, a historical artifact of pseudoscience, misinterpretation, or placebo. Yet its existence is undeniable. A real patent was issued, demonstrations were conducted, claims were made, and never fully addressed or dismantled with data. It is a closed case but not a resolved one. The story of the Hieronymus machine raises uncomfortable questions. If a device like this were real, it would challenge the foundations of how we understand interaction between matter, energy, and consciousness. It would suggest that intent, form, and observation could play an active role in physical processes. That symbolic structures, not just materials, could affect outcomes. There is no place for that idea in today's scientific framework. And so, rather than being attacked or disproven, the device was quietly abandoned. Not banned, not destroyed, just left to disappear. Whether it ever worked as claimed may never be known. But the fact that it existed, patented, promoted, and replicated, is a reminder that science, at its edges, does not always progress by consensus. Sometimes it simply moves on and leaves the inconvenient pieces behind. The Hieronymus machine is one of those pieces. The Correa PAGD device. In the early 1990s, a pair of researchers from Canada quietly filed a series of patents for a device that, if real, could challenge the core assumptions of modern physics and energy production. Their names were Paulo N. Correa and Alexandra N. Correa, and the technology they presented was unlike anything being developed in mainstream laboratories. They called it the PAGD, or Pulsed Abnormal Glow Discharge Device. The Correas were not amateur inventors. Paulo was a physicist and electrochemist, Alexandra a biophysicist. Their research was dense, highly technical, and supported by multiple patents issued by the United States Patent and Trademark Office. What they described was a system that produced anomalous energy output. In simple terms, more energy coming out than what was put in. And this wasn't a vague claim. They provided numbers, experimental setups, and performance data. The heart of the PAGD system lies in a particular behavior of electrical plasma inside a vacuum tube. Under normal conditions, when high voltage is applied to a gas-filled vacuum tube, the gas ionizes and produces a glow, a phenomenon well understood since the days of Nikola Tesla. But the Correas found that under specific conditions, the glow discharge did something strange. It would spontaneously shift into what they called abnormal glow discharge, a pulsing, highly energetic state that produced sudden bursts of current far exceeding the input. This wasn't just a minor anomaly. According to their data, the system generated kinetic energy, heat, and electrical current in excess of what classical electrodynamics could account for. They weren't claiming a perpetual motion machine. Instead, they insisted they had found a way to tap into a previously unrecognized form of energy, one that might originate from the vacuum itself. They published their work through their company, Aurora Biophysics Research Institute, and quickly accumulated several patents between 1994 and 1997. These patents were not speculative. They were written in formal engineering language, complete with diagrams and detailed technical parameters. Reviewers at the patent office, typically conservative when it comes to over-unity claims, approved them. For many, this alone was disturbing. If the device was impossible, how did it pass scrutiny? If it worked, why wasn't it everywhere? The Correas were careful. They never claimed to have built a free energy machine. Instead, they proposed that the PAGD device was tapping into a non-thermal, non-electromagnetic source of energy associated with quantum vacuum fluctuations or ether-like phenomena. They cited work from historical figures like Tesla, Reich, and Aspdin, and argued that conventional physics had ignored or mischaracterized subtle energetic phenomena present in vacuum systems. They also demonstrated that their device produced electromechanical motion. Their tests showed a rotating motor driven directly by the output of a PAGD reactor. That meant that the anomalous electrical output wasn't just theoretical voltage. It could be converted into actual work. According to them, this was measured, repeatable, and consistent. But there was a problem. No one else was replicating it. Whether due to the complexity of the setup, the lack of funding, or fear of professional risk, the scientific community remained silent. The Correas continued publishing technical monographs, but their work was mostly ignored by academia. At best, it was dismissed as experimental error. At worst, it was labeled pseudoscience. Still, their work never vanished. Copies of their patents and research papers circulated among fringe physicists, independent engineers, and a growing community of energy researchers convinced that something fundamental had been hidden or overlooked by mainstream science. Then, quietly, the Correas stopped publishing. Over time, their website went offline. The patents remained, but the researchers themselves disappeared from public view. No public demonstrations. No commercial applications. No refutations or confirmations. Just silence. To this day, there are no mainstream experiments designed to replicate the PAGD device under peer-reviewed conditions. No high-profile laboratory has ever attempted to test it in a controlled environment with third-party oversight. This absence of scrutiny is one of the most unsettling aspects of the story. If the claims were absurd, they should have been easily debunked. If they were valid, they should have been revolutionary. Instead, the reaction was inertia. Some researchers argue that the PAGD device threatens too many established systems, the energy industry, academic funding hierarchies, and the foundations of thermodynamics itself. To seriously consider such a machine would require re-examining Maxwell's equations, the limits of quantum field theory, and the assumptions baked into electrical engineering curricula across the globe. For that reason, they say it was easier to ignore. But ignoring a system doesn't erase it. The patents still exist. The diagrams still circulate. And the core idea, that certain types of plasma behavior can trigger non-classical energy events, is beginning to re-emerge in the fringes of modern research under new names. Vacuum energy extraction, zero-point energy, and non-equilibrium thermodynamics. It's unclear whether the Correas abandoned their work, were pressured into silence, or chose isolation. What is clear is that no mainstream institution has ever taken on the task of verifying or disproving their claims in full. The scientific record is not a list of resolved questions. It is also a map of avoided ones. The PAGD device remains one of them. Not proven, not refuted, just filed, described, and ignored. For a world on the edge of climate and energy collapse, the idea that a working energy technology may have been left behind, whether from institutional bias, political pressure, or simple disbelief, is hard to confront. It's easier to believe that such machines are myths, that the inventors were misguided, that the data was flawed, but the documents exist, and the silence that followed them is louder than denial. Joe Cell, the Australian hydrogen cell. In the mid-1990s, a man known only as Joe appeared in the pages of obscure Australian engineering magazines and alternative energy newsletters. His identity was intentionally kept vague. No full name, no academic background, no affiliation with any scientific institution. Just a first name, a quiet demeanor, and a device that, if his claims were true, could challenge the entire concept of how internal combustion engines function. Came to be known as the Joe Cell, and at first glance it didn't look like much. It was a small, cylindrical container made of concentric stainless steel tubes submerged in water. No moving parts, no fuel injectors, no pressurized tanks. Just water, usually distilled, and a 12-volt power supply. According to Joe, once the cell was properly constructed, tuned, and charged, it could power a standard gasoline engine without any conventional fuel. No gasoline, no diesel, not even hydrogen gas in the traditional sense. The cell, he said, didn't burn hydrogen. It didn't even produce significant quantities of measurable gas. Instead, it emitted a mysterious form of energy, one not fully understood or acknowledged by modern science. Joe claimed this energy was drawn not from chemical reactions, but from the orgone field, a concept first proposed by Wilhelm Reich in the 1930s to describe a kind of universal life energy. Skeptics dismissed it immediately. The idea that water, pulsed with low-voltage current, could generate a non-fuel energy capable of powering a combustion engine made no sense according to any known laws of physics. Combustion requires a fuel-air mixture and a spark. The Joe Cell seemed to bypass all three, operating, allegedly, not by igniting a substance, but by facilitating an energetic field that caused the engine's internal combustion process to occur in an entirely new way. Despite the disbelief, something about the device drew attention. Alternative energy enthusiasts began building their own Joe Cells based on rough schematics and notes shared online. The construction was deceptively simple. A series of stainless steel cylinders nested inside one another, forming tubes within tubes, submerged in water. The outermost casing was usually an insulated plastic or acrylic container. When current was applied, the cell would begin to bubble slightly, but not at levels consistent with traditional electrolysis. That was the first anomaly. In standard electrolysis, water splits into hydrogen and oxygen gas, which can then be collected and burned. But Joe insisted his cell produce something else, a form of energetic charge, invisible and unmeasurable by conventional instruments, but detectable by its effects. He claimed it required a special alignment of materials, correct geometry, and, more strangely, a kind of energetic tuning. The water itself had to be conditioned over time, exposed to the natural environment, and never contaminated with synthetic chemicals. Some users even insisted the device worked better when kept in line with planetary magnetic fields. The second anomaly was even more provocative. Joe demonstrated a modified car engine running with the cell installed. According to reports and limited video evidence, the car operated with the fuel line disconnected. The spark plugs remained, but the engine ran with no gasoline in the tank. Witnesses claimed to have driven in the car. Some said it ran smoother, cooler, and quieter than normal. Others believed it was an elaborate hoax, with hidden fuel sources or sleight of hand. What made the Joe Cell different from typical water fuel claims was its complete lack of scientific explanation. Joe never claimed to be splitting hydrogen and burning it. He rejected conventional thermodynamics entirely. Instead, he framed the device in terms of resonance, field interaction, and bioenergetics, concepts borrowed from esoteric physics and fringe biology. To many, it sounded like pseudoscience. To others, it sounded like suppressed knowledge. Then came the familiar pattern. Joe claimed he was harassed. He reported being followed, threatened, and told to stop sharing his technology. Some associates claimed the same. Rumors spread that automotive and energy corporations were keeping a close eye on anyone experimenting with the cell. A few researchers claimed their equipment had been confiscated by customs or that strange men had arrived at their homes asking questions. At the same time, others tried to commercialize the cell, or at least replicate it under controlled conditions. Some experimenters claimed success, at least temporarily. Others could not get it to work. The instructions were often vague, and the activation process seemed inconsistent. Joe insisted that the key was intention. The cell would not work if built by someone who did not believe in the energy field. That statement alone destroyed any credibility among scientists. Machines should not care what their builders believe. But that was the essence of the Joe cell's mystery. It operated on the edge between matter and mind, machine and field. It claimed to draw from an energy source not taught in physics textbooks. Consciousness interacting with structured water and geometry. No academic institution ever tested the cell under controlled, blind conditions. No peer-reviewed studies examined its behavior. It remained underground, passed from hand to hand, rebuilt in garages, debated in forums, and whispered about in energy circles. Occasionally, it resurfaced in YouTube videos, often with poor audio and shaky camera angles, showing modified engines rumbling with no fuel lines connected. These clips fueled further speculation, but no concrete proof. Joe himself eventually disappeared from public view. Whether he chose anonymity or was pushed into silence is unclear. What remains is the blueprint of a device that, by every standard of known physics, should not work. And yet, enough people insist that it did to keep the story alive. Today, the Joe cell occupies a strange place in technological folklore. Not a scam, not a confirmed breakthrough, but something in between. It raises more questions than it answers. If it was a hoax, it was executed with a level of precision and longevity unusual for fraud. If it was real, it would represent a complete restructuring of how we understand energy, combustion, and perhaps even consciousness itself. And yet, no government bans were issued. No official takedowns. Just absence of funding, of institutional interest, of verification. As with so many forbidden inventions, the Joe cell wasn't publicly destroyed. It was simply never allowed to exist. David Hamel's anti-gravity craft. In a quiet town in Ontario, Canada, during the 1990s, an elderly man named David Hamel began to attract the attention of a very particular kind of audience. Those who believed that gravity could be overcome, that the laws of motion were not yet fully written, and that the future of transportation had already been discovered but kept hidden. Hamel was not a physicist. He had no academic credentials, no laboratory. What he had was conviction, and blueprints for a machine he claimed could defy gravity. Hamel's story began, as many fringe inventions do, with an alleged moment of revelation. He said that in the 1970s he experienced a direct contact with higher intelligence, not in the science fiction sense of aliens or UFOs, but as an informational download. A sudden understanding of how nature worked at its most fundamental level. He believed he had been given knowledge, not learned it, and with that knowledge he began building. What emerged over the next 2 decades was a series of strange, highly geometric devices made primarily from magnets, aluminum cones, and granite spheres. At first glance, his machines looked like abstract sculptures, combinations of rotating discs, nested cones, and magnetic fields arranged in symmetrical layers. But Hamel insisted they were not symbolic. They were functional. Their purpose, to tap into a natural energy, one he described as the spiraling life force of the Earth itself. Central to his design was the concept of spin, specifically, the interaction of magnetic fields in opposing rotational directions. He believed that when properly aligned, these opposing fields would create a form of resonant uplift, neutralizing gravity and creating an energetic vortex strong enough to lift an object off the ground without combustion, propulsion, or traditional thrust. It sounded impossible, and yet Hamel was not vague. He provided drawings, mechanical breakdowns, and explanations for every component. He spoke about electromagnetic implosion, about zero-point energy, and structured motion within a vacuum. To scientists, it was gibberish. To others, it sounded like something just beyond current understanding, as if he were using the wrong vocabulary to describe something real. Hamel claimed that some of his prototypes had briefly levitated. He described incidents where the device would begin to shake, hum, and lift before violently falling apart. He blamed instability, poor materials, and the difficulty of controlling the forces at play. There were no videos, no peer-reviewed papers, no independent confirmations. But there were witnesses, tinkerers, engineers, and believers who visited him and saw the machines. Many left confused, but intrigued. He didn't sell kits. He didn't start a company. He simply built and shared what he believed to be the truth, that gravity was not a force to be resisted, but a condition to be bypassed through geometric and magnetic resonance. One of the most perplexing elements of his work was that it mirrored, almost accidentally, theories being explored in mainstream speculative physics, particularly ideas around zero-point energy and inertial mass reduction. While Hamel used non-academic terms, some researchers noted that his conceptual framework bore a strange resemblance to hypotheses about manipulating the quantum vacuum to achieve propulsion without mass expenditure. Despite this, no serious institution took notice. The complexity of his designs, combined with the unorthodox language he used to describe them, made his work virtually impossible to evaluate by traditional standards. He wasn't building from equations. He was building from intuition, from what he believed had been revealed to him directly by nature. And because of that, most dismissed him outright. But then there were the disappearances. Not of people, but of objects. Hamel claimed that, during certain tests, small metallic components had simply vanished inside the energized chamber of his machine. Not disintegrated. Not melted. Gone. He believed this was evidence of dimensional interference, that his device had created a localized field capable of partially exiting our observable spacetime. Again, unverifiable. Again, unprovable. But to those who followed his work, it was another piece of a larger puzzle. He eventually began constructing larger versions of the craft. These were often shaped like tapered drums or bell-like structures, with massive arrays of permanent magnets arranged in spirals. He spent years building them by hand, sometimes with the help of volunteers, and always in solitude, away from government agencies, corporations, or universities. He believed that his work would never be accepted, and that attempting to commercialize it would be dangerous. He may have been right. In the world of fringe energy research, there is a long-standing pattern. Those who claim too much, especially in the realm of antigravity, often find themselves silenced not by force, but by neglect.
No grants. No labs.
No peer review. Just the quiet exclusion that pushes inconvenient ideas to the edge of obscurity. Hamel lived in relative poverty, continuing his work into old age. He granted interviews, spoke at alternative science conferences, and invited people to examine his machines firsthand. But without formal support, his work never scaled beyond hand-built prototypes. When he died in 2004, his designs were archived by a small community of followers, but most of the devices themselves were lost, scrapped, or deteriorated. What remains is a trail of drawings, diagrams, and photographs, and a handful of individuals who still attempt to rebuild his work. Online, blueprints circulate among small engineering forums and alternative energy websites. Some claim partial replications. Others say it was all fantasy. No one knows for certain. Like many others on the edge of science, Hamel's story is not one of fraud or deception, but of deep isolation. He believed he was right. He believed the Earth itself held the key to flight, not through force but through resonance, through alignment, through understanding the spin of life and matter at its most elemental level. The academic world never replied. The media never covered his death.
No obituaries. No retrospectives.
Just silence. And maybe that's the most telling part. His work was never debunked. It was simply ignored, not because it was wrong, but because it could not be processed by the systems built to decide what counts as knowledge. And so, the question remains unanswered. Did David Hamel discover something real? Or did he build beautiful machines powered only by belief? Either way, the world never found out. The Philadelphia Experiment. In 1943, during the height of World War II, rumors began to circulate about a secret U.S. Navy experiment conducted at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. According to the story, the Navy was attempting to make a warship invisible not to radar but to the naked eye. The test allegedly involved the USS Eldridge, D-173, a destroyer escort, and the application of powerful electromagnetic fields. The result, if reports are to be believed, was not a successful cloaking event, but a catastrophic technological failure that injured or killed members of the crew and left lasting physical and psychological damage. The account did not originate from official sources. It emerged years later, in the 1950s, through a series of letters sent to UFO researcher Morris K. Jessup. The author of these letters, a man named Carl M. Allen, who also used the alias Carlos Allende, claimed to have witnessed the event from another ship in the harbor. His descriptions were vague, but alarming. He stated that the Eldridge disappeared in a greenish haze, reappeared several hundred kilometers away in Norfolk, Virginia, and then returned to Philadelphia, all within minutes. He also claimed that some sailors were physically embedded in the hull of the ship when it rematerialized. Jessup was disturbed enough to bring the letters to the attention of the U.S. Navy. They responded by printing a limited annotated edition of Jessup's book, The Case for the UFO, containing Allen's handwritten notes in the margins. This unusual step only intensified public interest. The Navy made no formal statement beyond denying that any such experiment had ever taken place. But the silence from official sources, combined with the strange nature of the correspondence, gave the story momentum. No hard evidence has ever surfaced to support the claim. The logs of the USS Eldridge show it was not in Philadelphia at the time of the alleged experiment. Naval officers involved with the ship have denied the story outright. But the narrative refuses to disappear, largely because it intersects with several areas of legitimate scientific inquiry, including electromagnetic field theory, general relativity, and stealth technology. At its core, the Philadelphia experiment story rests on the premise that the U.S. Navy was testing a form of electromagnetic field manipulation that could bend light around an object, effectively rendering it invisible. This is conceptually similar to modern metamaterial cloaking and theoretical gravitational lensing. The speculative part comes from the claim that the fields used were so intense they affected not only light, but space-time itself. Some versions of the story go further, alleging that the ship briefly entered another dimension, or a hyperspace bubble, during which time standard physics no longer applied. When the vessel returned, crew members were found partially fused with the ship's metal structure. Others were said to have disappeared entirely or gone insane. These reports were never substantiated, but they became central to the mythos. The scientific feasibility of such an experiment remains unconfirmed. Electromagnetic fields strong enough to affect spacetime would require levels of energy far beyond anything available in the 1940s. Even today, large-scale electromagnetic field generators, such as those used in particle accelerators, operate under extreme containment protocols and cannot manipulate matter in the ways described. Still, the idea of electromagnetic propulsion and invisibility through field distortion was not entirely fictional. Around the same time, prominent figures like Nikola Tesla and later, in theory, scientists like John von Neumann and Albert Einstein were exploring aspects of unified field theory, the attempt to mathematically link gravity, electromagnetism, and other fundamental forces. The Philadelphia experiment is often linked, without evidence, to these theoretical developments. Tesla, who died in January 1943, is sometimes cited as having contributed to the project, although no documentation exists. What is notable is how the story spread. It became part of a broader movement in the 1960s and 1970s, a mixture of conspiracy theory, suppressed technology, and Cold War secrecy. Books, documentaries, and interviews kept the narrative alive. In the 1980s, the story was fictionalized in a film titled The Philadelphia Experiment, which introduced the legend to a wider audience. From that point forward, the story became self-sustaining. For those who believe the experiment occurred, the lack of evidence is part of the proof. They argue that any successful manipulation of space-time or matter would have been immediately classified. Witnesses would have been silenced or discredited. Documentation would have been destroyed or fabricated. In this view, the truth is hidden not because it is false, but because it is too dangerous to acknowledge. Skeptics point out the inconsistencies in Allen's letters, the lack of credible eyewitnesses, and the impossibility of the physics described. They argue that the story is a fabrication, a misunderstanding, or a deliberate hoax, perhaps invented as a form of misinformation during wartime. The Navy's annotated reprint of Jessup's book is often cited as an oddity, but not necessarily proof. Even among researchers interested in advanced propulsion, few give serious attention to the Philadelphia experiment. The lack of replicable data and the reliance on anecdotal reports make it difficult to evaluate scientifically. Nevertheless, the story remains relevant, particularly in discussions of black projects, covert government programs operating outside public oversight. Some theorists suggest that the Philadelphia experiment narrative was intentionally planted to distract from real electromagnetic or propulsion experiments being conducted at the time, perhaps involving radar camouflage, degaussing systems, or early stealth research. If so, the legend served its purpose. It focused attention on the fantastical and away from the verifiable. What keeps the story alive is not the evidence, but the concept. The idea that governments might pursue technologies so advanced and so unstable that even those developing them do not fully understand the consequences. The possibility that, somewhere in the pursuit of advantage, something irreversible was triggered, hidden, and never discussed again. In the decades since, no other major experiment has been officially linked to the Philadelphia claims. No whistleblower has produced documents. No sailor has come forward with verifiable injuries or testimony. But the idea that electromagnetic fields could tear through the normal structure of reality remains in circulation. It is no longer about a single ship. It is about the possibility that there are things governments have tried, things that went wrong, and things that were buried not for national security, but because no one knew how to explain what happened. And perhaps they still don't. The Russian Woodpecker, Duga radar. From the mid-1970s until the fall of the Soviet Union, a strange signal could be heard across the shortwave radio spectrum. It was repetitive, sharp, and rhythmic, a rapid tapping that resembled the sound of a woodpecker. Operators around the world noticed it, amateur radio enthusiasts, military analysts, and civilian broadcasters. The signal was powerful, pulsing at roughly 10 Hz, and it was impossible to ignore. It disrupted communications, spanned continents, and operated continuously. It became known as the Russian Woodpecker. For over a decade, its origin was a mystery. Theories ranged from mind control experiments to weather manipulation to submarine communication systems. In reality, the signal originated from a massive over-the-horizon radar system known as Duga. Built by the Soviet military, the Duga radar was located near Chernobyl, Ukraine, and stood as one of the most powerful and imposing surveillance instruments of the Cold War era. The system was part of the Soviet Union's early warning infrastructure, designed to detect incoming intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, from the United States. Unlike conventional radar, which is limited to line-of-sight detection, over-the-horizon OTH radar systems bounce high-frequency signals off the Earth's ionosphere, allowing them to scan thousands of kilometers beyond the horizon. The concept was sound, but the implementation was complex, requiring immense power, massive antennas, and highly sensitive receivers. The Duga radar array was monumental in scale. Its transmitting and receiving antennas stretched nearly 700 meters long and over 150 meters high. Built in secrecy in the forests near Pripyat, the installation consumed enormous amounts of electrical power, much of it drawn from the nearby Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Its construction was hidden from Western intelligence for years, despite its enormous physical footprint. When the system came online in 1976, it began transmitting the now infamous tapping signal. To those who didn't understand its origin, it was deeply unsettling. Some believed it was interfering intentionally with global communication systems. Others speculated it was an attempt at psychological warfare. A low-frequency signal meant to agitate populations or disrupt biological rhythms. Even after its military purpose was revealed, suspicions persisted. The secrecy of its development, the intensity of the signal, and its persistence all contributed to an atmosphere of paranoia. The radar worked, but not perfectly. The ionosphere is a dynamic and unpredictable medium. Solar activity, weather patterns, and electromagnetic noise all influenced signal clarity and reliability. The Duga system reportedly generated many false positives. Despite its power, its accuracy was limited, and its strategic usefulness questioned even within the Soviet command structure. Still, it operated for years, continuously broadcasting its signature sound, audible to anyone with a shortwave radio and enough curiosity. During this time, it disrupted civilian broadcasts, emergency channels, and even aviation communication. Complaints came from across the world, but the Soviet Union never acknowledged the signal. In the Western world, the mystery took on a life of its own. The lack of official information allowed conspiracy theories to flourish. Some claimed the Woodpecker signal was a form of mind control technology, operating on frequencies close to the brain's natural rhythms. Others linked it to weather modification or HAARP-style ionospheric experimentation, decades before such programs were publicly discussed. A few even claimed it was causing mass psychological effects or contributing to unknown biological illnesses. These theories were never substantiated. The truth, when it finally emerged, was more grounded but still unsettling. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, satellite imagery, defectors, and internal documents confirmed the Duga's existence. Western intelligence had long suspected it was an OTH radar installation, and this was ultimately proven correct. But the full details of its construction, cost, and performance remained classified or lost in the post-Soviet collapse. The final chapter of the Duga system came abruptly in April 1986. When reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded, it created the worst nuclear disaster in human history. The resulting radiation release contaminated the region, forcing the evacuation of Pripyat and the surrounding areas. The Duga radar complex, located just a few kilometers from the power plant, was abandoned. The highly radioactive environment made continued operation impossible. The Soviet Union shut down the program silently, without public announcement. What was left behind was a towering metal skeleton in the forest, a monument to Cold War ambition and secrecy. Today, the Duga radar still stands, decaying slowly in the exclusion zone. Its massive array rises above the treetops, rusted and overgrown. It has become a destination for explorers, researchers, and those drawn to the strange legacy of Soviet experimentation. The Russian Woodpecker signal fell silent after the Chernobyl disaster. Its sudden disappearance only deepened the mystery for those unaware of the Duga radar's existence. In time, the name came to refer not just to the signal, but to the entire structure, a symbol of hidden technologies, military secrecy, and the unintended consequences of unchecked ambition. Although its true purpose is now known, the Duga radar remains surrounded by questions. Why was so much power devoted to a system with such limited accuracy? Why was it located so close to a nuclear power plant? Did it have secondary capabilities that remain classified? And what about the psychological impact? Even if the signal wasn't designed for mind control, it undeniably influenced the consciousness of those who heard it. Thousands of shortwave listeners, over many years, were exposed to its rhythmic tapping. In an age before the internet, it became one of the few globally shared audio phenomena, persistent and intrusive. No direct harm was ever proven. No laws were broken, but the sense of intrusion, of being monitored by something vast and unknown, left an impression. The Duga radar was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It was a listening ear, one so large and sensitive it had to shout to the entire planet just to hear something faint on the horizon. And in doing so, it revealed more than just military ambition. It exposed how little the public truly knew about what was happening behind closed borders, in closed systems with closed intentions. The Russian Woodpecker was never intended to be heard. But for over a decade, it echoed across the globe anyway. And then, just as mysteriously as it began, it vanished. Kowsky-Frost crystal power device. In the early 20th century, at the dawn of modern electrical science, an obscure report surfaced in the Scientific American supplement that would quietly vanish from mainstream history. It involved two scientists, Justin Kowsky and T.T. Frost, who, according to the brief publication, had stumbled upon a crystal-based technology that allegedly produced powerful, non-chemical energy reactions. Unlike anything known at the time or even today, their discovery implied that certain crystals, when processed under specific conditions, could interact with electromagnetic fields in a way that resulted in levitation and energy release. The article, dated April 1927, was titled Remarkable Electrical Phenomena in a Newly Discovered Crystal. It described how Kowsky and Frost, while working with high-pressure crystallization experiments, produced a synthetic material that did not behave like any conventional substance. The crystal, when subjected to a strong electric field, began to oscillate, glow, and eventually exhibit loss of weight, a term which in the 1920s was a polite way of describing levitation. They reported that a small platform, when placed over this energized crystal, would rise above it, unsupported, without magnetism or mechanical thrust. They claimed that the effect could be sustained, amplified, and even directed. The implications were staggering. If real, it suggested that the crystal was interacting with gravitational or inertial forces, bypassing known mechanics entirely. The article included a schematic and claimed that the phenomenon was reproducible. The authors stated they were working toward building a larger version of the device and intended to conduct public demonstrations. But after that publication, nothing. No follow-up article. No public demonstration. No technical papers. No further mention in scientific records. The report disappeared as quietly as it had appeared. What makes the Kowsky-Frost case particularly unsettling is the complete lack of historical trace. Unlike other fringe energy stories, this one originated in a mainstream scientific publication. Scientific American, even its supplements, was widely circulated and respected. The publication was not known for indulging pseudoscience. And yet, despite this early exposure, the names of the inventors, the crystal composition, and the experimental results vanished entirely from public discourse. Attempts to verify the identities of Kowsky and Frost lead nowhere. No academic records, no institutional affiliations, no patents. It's as if the article was written about ghosts. Skeptics argue that the entire thing may have been fictional, a filler article or speculative fiction published as science, which was not uncommon in the 1920s. However, there is no disclaimer, no satirical framing, no indicators of fictionality in the piece itself. It was written in the formal tone of a research summary, complete with technical observations and illustrations. If it was fiction, it was not marked as such. More disturbingly, independent researchers have attempted to reconstruct the device based on the original schematic. The materials described, dielectric plates, metallic contacts, and processed quartz crystals, are all well understood. Several experimenters in the fringe science community have reported anomalous behaviors when attempting similar configurations. Sudden voltage spikes, unexplained temperature drops, and, in rare claims, levitation of lightweight objects. None of these replications have been verified under controlled conditions. The scientific community has never formally addressed the Kowsky-Frost report. There are no official retractions or rebuttals. It simply stopped existing, not in the archival sense but in cultural memory. Even among historians of science, the report is a footnote at best, if it is remembered at all. This is not the normal trajectory of flawed science. Typically, failed experiments are debated, criticized, and eventually discredited through repetition or peer review. But in this case, there was no debate, no repetition, no academic critique. Only silence. That silence has become part of the mystery. Some speculate that the energy generated by the crystal was not merely electromagnetic but involved subatomic structural resonance, a concept not recognized at the time and still not well understood today. In this theory, the crystal may have interacted with zero-point fields or vacuum energy fluctuations, phenomena now tentatively explored in quantum field theory. Others propose that the effect was a piezonuclear reaction, where mechanical pressure on certain crystals may induce low-level nuclear events. While this concept remains controversial, modern experiments with stressed crystalline structures have produced anomalies in neutron emission and energy shifts that challenge existing nuclear models. If Kowsky and Frost had stumbled upon such a reaction without understanding it, they might have created a non-chemical, non-radiative energy source, one capable of defying gravity, or at least interfering with inertial mass. In a world on the brink of industrialized warfare, such a technology, even poorly understood, would have been of immediate strategic interest. And that raises the inevitable question: did someone intervene? Throughout the 20th century, many promising energy technologies disappeared under similar circumstances. Inventors would go silent, documents would vanish, experiments would become unrepeatable. In many cases, the explanation was simple, the science was flawed. But in a few, like this one, there was never enough information to evaluate the claim at all. If the Kowsky-Frost crystal was a hoax, it was executed in the least profitable way possible, published once and abandoned. If it was real, it was one of the earliest known references to what we now call exotic matter interactions, well before modern physics began to explore the edges of condensed matter and quantum fields. And if it was something else, something never meant to be known, then perhaps the silence that followed wasn't accidental. Today, the original Scientific American Supplement article still exists in microfilm archives. Researchers can read it, analyze it, but without names, samples, or further data, it remains frozen in time, a single anomaly in the record of science. A one-page account of something that should not have happened, and yet was printed as fact. No one has found the crystal, no one has found the men, and no one has explained why a published scientific breakthrough was never seen again. The Motionless Electromagnetic Generator by Tom Bearden. In the early 2000s, a retired U.S. Army lieutenant colonel named Thomas E. Bearden made a remarkable announcement. His team had developed a functioning over-unity energy device, one that could output more energy than it consumed. He called it the Motionless Electromagnetic Generator, or MEG. It had no moving parts, no fuel source, and no emissions. If true, it was a direct challenge to the most fundamental law of classical physics, the conservation of energy. The MEG was not presented as a vague concept or speculative theory. Bearden and his collaborators, including electrical engineer Stephen Patrick, filed a U.S. patent for the device in 2002, U.S. patent number 6,362,718, and it was granted. The patent described a system that utilized the nonlinear magnetic properties of certain materials, in combination with precise pulsing of magnetic fields, to extract usable energy from what Bearden described as the active vacuum, the zero-point energy field predicted by quantum theory. At its core, the MEG used a specially conditioned magnetic core surrounded by 4 electromagnetic coils. 2 of the coils pulsed energy into the core, while the other 2 extracted it. Unlike conventional transformers or generators, there was no physical motion. The term motionless referred to the fact that the system relied entirely on electromagnetic field dynamics, specifically the manipulation of potential energy gradients, rather than mechanical work. Bearden claimed the MEG could tap into the vacuum energy that exists everywhere in space, a field of fluctuating electromagnetic activity that, according to quantum electrodynamics, permeates all of existence. Mainstream physics acknowledges this vacuum energy theoretically, but no technology has ever been able to extract it in a controlled and sustained way. According to Bearden, that's exactly what the MEG was doing. He supported his claim with technical documentation, laboratory test data, and references to well-established but underexplored concepts in electromagnetic theory, particularly the work of James Clerk Maxwell, whose original 20-equation model was later simplified into the 4 equations used in standard engineering. Bearden argued that this simplification, done by Oliver Heaviside and others, had erased the underlying mechanisms for potential energy extraction from the vacuum. In other words, mainstream electrical engineering had mathematically deleted the free energy solution, not maliciously, but through an attempt to make Maxwell's theory more practical. Bearden believed the MEG exploited what had been left behind. The reaction from the scientific community was one of complete silence, followed by dismissal. The mainstream position is simple. Over-unity devices violate the first law of thermodynamics. Energy cannot be created from nothing. Even quantum vacuum fluctuations, while real, are believed to be symmetrical and self-canceling, and therefore not exploitable in a classical energy system. But Bearden was not alone in his claims. Other researchers in fringe and alternative physics communities supported his interpretation. They pointed to emerging studies in Casimir effect, quantum tunneling, and zero-point field interactions as evidence that energy might exist in usable forms beyond conventional fuel sources. The MEG was tested in private labs. In 2003, Bearden claimed the device was producing over 100% energy efficiency, sometimes up to 500%, depending on the configuration. These results were never verified by independent peer-reviewed studies. Critics argued that any apparent gains could be explained by measurement errors, circuit feedback, or data misinterpretation. But unlike many free energy devices, the MEG had something rare: a granted patent. While the U.S. Patent Office generally rejects perpetual motion machines, Bearden's submission avoided that label by grounding itself in magnetic field theory and nonlinear materials, rather than overt claims of violating thermodynamics. The patent was not an endorsement, but it was a recognition of novelty, and that distinction mattered. Despite this, the MEG never reached production. Bearden announced multiple times that a commercial version of the device was being prepared. He stated that licensing agreements were signed with a European firm, and that within 2 years, the device would be made available to the public, capable of powering homes without connection to the grid. That announcement was made over 20 years ago. No commercial MEG ever materialized. No public demonstrations followed. And then silence. Supporters of Bearden argue that he was silenced or suppressed, that funding was pulled under pressure, that regulatory obstacles were used to stall development. Others say that the device worked, but that its behavior was inherently unstable, depending on field fluctuations too sensitive to reproduce consistently. Bearden himself often stated that the MEG was difficult to control, and that interference from ambient electromagnetic fields could collapse the vacuum alignment necessary for operation. Skeptics remain firm. If it worked, someone would have replicated it by now. But the blueprints, while public, are incomplete. The key lies in the magnetic materials, specially conditioned alloys with nonlinear properties, possibly proprietary or no longer manufactured. Without them, the MEG is just a diagram. Bearden continued to publish until his death in 2021. He wrote extensively about scalar energy, longitudinal waves, and electrogravitation. He believed that energy systems, as we know them, are built on incomplete foundations. In his view, the MEG was not just a machine, but a correction to a broken scientific framework. But time has passed. The world has largely forgotten the MEG. In scientific databases, it barely exists. In academic papers, it is ignored. And yet, in small communities, forums, archives, off-grid laboratories, the patent still circulates. The idea still lingers. What if energy does not need to be generated, only unlocked? What if the vacuum is not empty but full and we simply lack the tools to reach in? What if the MEG worked? Not forever, not perfectly, but just enough to prove the world operates on laws we don't fully understand. That possibility remains, unconfirmed, unrefuted, unexplored. The Black Knight satellite. High above Earth, in the realm of cold silence and orbital decay, a persistent rumor has followed human space activity for nearly a century, that an unknown artificial object has been orbiting the planet, not launched by any nation, not part of any known satellite constellation, and not accounted for in public space tracking data. It is known as the Black Knight satellite. The story is a complex mesh of documented observations, misunderstood signals, and decades of speculative reconstruction. At its core lies a simple but unsettling question. Is there something in orbit around Earth that predates our space age? And if so, who put it there? The origin of the Black Knight legend is not a single event, but a patchwork of incidents. The first threads trace back to the 1899 experiments of Nikola Tesla, who claimed to have detected a repeating extraterrestrial radio signal while working on wireless transmission from his Colorado Springs laboratory. Tesla believed the signals were not natural and suggested they were being sent intentionally from a distant intelligence. Mainstream science at the time dismissed this idea, attributing the phenomenon to Earth-based or atmospheric interference. Then, in the 1920s, Norwegian engineer Jørgen Hals also reported receiving long-delay echoes, radio signals that bounced back to his equipment several seconds after transmission. This behavior was unexplained and remains one of the more puzzling anomalies in early radio science. Theories ranged from signal reflection off distant layers of the ionosphere to interactions with unknown objects in space. In 1954, 3 years before Sputnik, and before any human-made satellite was ever launched, reports began to emerge in U.S. newspapers citing statements by Air Force personnel and defense contractors that a mysterious object was detected in Earth's orbit. These claims were vague and quickly dismissed, but they laid the groundwork for a persistent belief that an unidentified satellite was circling the planet. By the 1960s, the story escalated. In 1960, the U.S. Navy reported tracking a dark satellite in polar orbit, a feat not then achieved by the U.S. or the Soviet Union, as all known satellites were in equatorial orbits. Time magazine even published a brief article noting that this object was unexpected and not claimed by either superpower. The official explanation given later was that it was a piece of discarded space debris from a previous U.S. reconnaissance satellite, specifically a fragment of the Discoverer program, also known as Corona. The explanation satisfied many, but not all. In 1963, astronaut Gordon Cooper was reportedly conducting a solo mission aboard Mercury Atlas 9 when he claimed to see a greenish object pass near his capsule, one that was picked up on radar by ground control. NASA later denied the event occurred and attributed any unusual readings to equipment malfunction. Cooper, however, reportedly stood by his claim until his death. Then came the photographs. In 1998, during the STS-88 mission, the first shuttle mission to assemble the International Space Station, NASA released a series of photographs showing a dark, irregular object floating in space. The images, available in public archives, were quickly labeled by enthusiasts as visual confirmation of the Black Knight satellite. The object appears to have an asymmetric, almost sculptural form, with sharp edges and shadowed ridges. NASA explained it as thermal insulation blanket accidentally lost during an EVA, specifically from the shuttle Endeavour. But the explanation did not sit well with everyone. The object in the photos appeared large, unspinning, and distinctly non-reflective, traits not typical of drifting debris. Moreover, its geometry didn't match known insulation shapes. It was irregular yet stable, opaque yet oddly sculptural. While most experts accepted NASA's account, the images gave renewed life to the theory that there was something up there and that space agencies were downplaying its existence. At this point, the Black Knight had moved from rumor to modern mythology. Conspiracy theorists claimed it had been in orbit for 13,000 years, citing decoded signals and supposed historical references. Some tied it to ancient civilizations, lost technologies, or pre-human intelligence. Others suggested it was a monitoring device, placed in orbit to observe human development. These interpretations, while dramatic, are supported more by narrative momentum than evidence. But buried beneath the layers of fiction lies a core anomaly. That multiple, credible anomalies across different decades and technologies, Tesla signals, long-delay echoes, early orbital sightings, unexplained tracking events, all seem to point to something unexplained occurring at the edge of our atmosphere. What makes the Black Knight satellite story compelling is not that it has clear, hard proof, but that it refuses to fully disappear. Every attempted debunking, from misidentified debris to misinterpreted signals, is accepted by the scientific community, but leaves behind unanswered residue. Not because the explanations are invalid, but because they are often insufficient or incomplete. More importantly, there is no confirmed catalog entry in global satellite tracking data for an object that matches the Black Knight's description: large, polar orbiting, non-reflective, and persistent over decades. NORAD and private tracking agencies monitor thousands of objects, yet nothing appears to match the shape or trajectory described in public sightings. If it exists outside the ledger of official space infrastructure. That's where the unease begins. Could such an object be deliberately unregistered? Yes. Classified military satellites are launched frequently under cover identities. Could the Black Knight be one of them? Possibly, but unlikely, given its earliest reported appearances before the space age. Could it be a combination of misunderstood phenomena, stitched together into a convenient myth? Absolutely. But then one must ask, why has this particular myth endured so consistently? Unlike typical UFO reports or urban legends, the Black Knight story intersects with technical data, frequency anomalies, radar signatures, orbital observations, and photographic evidence. That alone distinguishes it. Even today, the term Black Knight satellite evokes more than just mystery. It represents the possibility that we are not the first, or that we are being observed, or that our understanding of what orbits above us is incomplete. No agency has ever claimed it, No mission has ever been directed to retrieve it. And yet, the idea persists not because of what we know but because of what we don't. In the vacuum of certainty, the Black Knight continues to orbit, perhaps physically, perhaps just in the collective consciousness. A cold, silent echo of something that never quite came into focus, but never quite went away. Tesla's earthquake machine. In the pantheon of forgotten technologies, few names evoke as much intrigue as Nikola Tesla. Brilliant, eccentric, and often decades ahead of his time, Tesla's contributions to modern electrical systems are undeniable. But among his more esoteric experiments lies a claim that continues to disturb. A device so simple in design, and yet so powerful in its potential, that even Tesla himself reportedly destroyed it after a single test. It has become known as Tesla's earthquake machine. According to Tesla's own accounts, in the late 1890s he constructed a small mechanical oscillator, a device roughly the size of a forearm, powered by compressed air or steam. It was intended to study mechanical resonance, the way in which vibrations, if matched to an object's natural frequency, could amplify into extreme oscillations. This is a well-understood principle in physics, and the same phenomenon that can shatter a wine glass with sound or cause a bridge to collapse under synchronized footfalls. Tesla believed that if this principle could be applied mechanically, rather than acoustically, it could have massive effects. Not metaphorical, but literal. He called it a vibrational transmitter, and according to his retelling, he built one and bolted it to the steel support beam of a building he was using as a lab in New York City. The result, he claimed, was catastrophic. He described how the device, once tuned to the natural frequency of the building, caused the entire structure to tremble. Workers several blocks away reported feeling the vibrations. Pipes burst. Windows cracked. The police were called. And Tesla, realizing he had created a runaway feedback loop, reportedly destroyed the device with a sledgehammer before it could do further damage. The story appeared in several retellings over Tesla's lifetime, some recounted by journalists, others by Tesla himself in interviews. The most cited source comes from an article in the New York World published in 1897, in which Tesla recounts his experiment in dramatic detail. He refers to the incident as the most tremendous experiment I ever performed. Skeptics dismiss it as self-mythologizing, an exaggeration by a man known for dramatic flair. They point out that no police records or structural reports corroborate such an event. They argue that a device that small could not, by any known engineering standard, produce such force. And yet, the principle of mechanical resonance is real. Under the right conditions, small inputs can result in massive oscillations if they align with the target's resonant frequency. Tesla's device reportedly operated at very specific low-frequency vibrations, somewhere in the range of 5 to 10 Hz, a range associated not only with building resonance but also with the resonant frequencies of human organs and geological formations. In modern structural engineering, seismic resonance is a critical concern. Entire buildings are designed to absorb or redirect vibrational energy from earthquakes to prevent collapse. The danger Tesla was playing with was not theoretical. Years later, Tesla stated that with a properly tuned oscillator, one could split the Earth like an apple. While that line is often interpreted as hyperbole, some physicists have taken the idea more seriously than one might expect. If a small oscillator could lock into the natural resonance of a larger structure and continue feeding energy into it without interruption, the effects could scale rapidly. Think of a child on a swing. The push is small, but when delivered at the exact right moment over and over, the motion increases. In Tesla's view, the same could be done with metal, bridges, buildings, even the ground itself. Decades later, military and industrial engineers began to explore vibration-based demolition technologies, using controlled resonance to collapse structures. Some of the most powerful mechanical pile drivers and rock crushers today operate not through brute force, but through focused oscillation. Tesla may have simply arrived at the same concept far earlier, and with far less containment. But what makes the earthquake machine story so unsettling isn't just the theoretical potential. It's the way it vanished. After the initial test, Tesla never demonstrated the device publicly again. He spoke of it occasionally, but no patents exist that directly describe the mechanism.
No surviving blueprints.
No confirmed reconstructions. What remains are scattered anecdotes, fragmented notes, and second-hand accounts, none of which offer enough technical specificity to fully replicate the machine. Yet attempts have been made. In the 20th and 21st centuries, hobbyists and engineers have tried to recreate the earthquake machine using Tesla's rough descriptions. Most efforts yield only modest vibrational effects, but a few claim that under certain conditions, particularly when connected to metal beams or structural supports, the device exhibits nonlinear amplification, producing localized tremors disproportionate to the device's input energy. None of these claims have been independently verified. No replication has reached mainstream recognition. But the idea persists, especially in fringe scientific communities and experimental engineering circles. There's also a strategic dimension to the earthquake machine, one that elevates the stakes. If such a device could truly destabilize structures, it would be portable, silent, and destructive, a potential weapon with no visible attack vector. Imagine an unmarked vehicle parked near a targeted building, deploying a low-frequency oscillator that causes imperceptible, building-wide resonance.
No explosives. No projectiles.
Just vibration, tuned and focused. Sounds like science fiction. But under Tesla's model, it was entirely mechanical. This possibility, whether real or speculative, has led some to suggest that Tesla's oscillator was not suppressed because it didn't work, but because it did. That the experiment in New York was a proof of concept, and that its implications were too unstable, too uncontrollable, or too dangerous to pursue further. Whether Tesla self-censored out of fear, or whether outside forces silenced him, remains unknown. What is known is that the oscillator never became part of his official legacy. Unlike his work on alternating current, radio, or wireless energy transmission, the earthquake machine was relegated to anecdote. No university studied it. No defense contractor licensed it. It became part of the mythos surrounding Tesla, one of many inventions whispered about but never seen. And perhaps that's exactly where it belongs. Because if Tesla truly discovered a way to tap into the resonant frequencies of the Earth itself, to vibrate matter into instability with nothing but rhythm and timing, then he had stumbled onto a force of nature, not unlike electricity or magnetism, but far less forgiving. It's one thing to channel power. It's another to shake the world apart with it. Ending. What if some inventions were never meant to exist? What if the ideas we buried in classified vaults, forgotten patents, or erased archives were not failures but threats? Not to governments, not to markets, but to control. How many devices were silenced not because they didn't work, but because they worked too well? And what if the real danger wasn't the machines themselves, but what they revealed? That energy might be infinite, that gravity might be manipulated, that the very structure of reality is more flexible than we're told. Ask yourself, what other technologies were hidden before we even knew to look? And more importantly, what have we already erased? That could have changed everything. If this video made you think, or doubt, or wonder, leave a comment below. Tell us what you believe should have never been built, or what should have never been destroyed. And if you want more stories like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss what comes next. Because the past doesn't always stay buried. And some inventions, no matter how deep you hide them, have a way of resurfacing. Share this with someone who thinks everything in history is accounted for. Because sometimes, the most dangerous thing isn't what we invent, it's what we try to forget.